All right, we're going to take a look at the OIM API a little bit and how we can use the remote client to make connections remotely and test the API a little bit. I don't recommend this as like a application solution to connect using the remote client to OIM. It's usually not the best performance option. But this is for like if you want to write a scheduled task, or if you're writing an adapter and you want to try out the API first and get things more or less working before you start actually deploying it to OIM. It'll save you a lot of time, and not to mention you can use this to actually learn the API without actually having to deploy stuff to OIM too. For the most part, not every one of the APIs will work from the remote client. It really depends on what they're doing. Some of them try to grab the database directly, and you can't really do that from the remote side. So anyway, that's a little bit of wrap up of what this thing can do. So how we make a connection is this class here. So we have, let's do this first. So here is a wrapper. These classes here are wrapping the OIM API. We'll get to that in a little bit. These are some useful things that you might need if you're running a scheduled task. You can read and write CSV files. This is a model that I need to do process task operations. And here are some utilities that come along with this. There's string utils. The whole idea was to keep the dependencies down. So all you need is the OIM client really to compile everything. But in order to connect with the remote client, you need all of these other ones here. So, and the other part of this is the logging. Okay, so I like to use log4j when I'm testing and debugging. OIM doesn't really use that. It uses JUL. So this is the log4j to JUL bridge. So when you run one of these tests, it's going to set up some JVM arguments to put this guy as the log manager for JUL. So essentially you can use JUL logging and still have control over it via the log4j properties here, which is really cool. And when you build your code and deploy it, you're not going to deploy any of this stuff with it. You don't. All of this will already be in OIM, and you're not making the remote connection anyway. So that's pretty much it with that stuff, the logging. Okay, so we talked about that. All right, so let's talk about the client. So this extends the helper client. The helper client is going to log in with a custom environment, which is being read from the JNDI properties. Okay, so when you connect to OIM, you need an initial context factory, which is a WebLogic login factory. And then you have, this is the location of, in the design console, where you have the authorization information that OIM uses to connect. This is basically a remote EJB connection using WebLogic's authentication, JSSE type stuff. I can't remember exactly what it does now, but you need all of this to make the connection. So here is the directory where OIM libraries are. So essentially you need to be able to run the design console in order to do this. So if you can't run the design console on your local machine, you won't be able to run this either. So we'll make some more videos on how to set up the design console, but there's already a ton of videos on the internet. I'll put some links to those in these videos here. So all right, we kind of went off tangent there, but this is basically what you need for the connection information. This is the server I'm connecting to, which is my VM over here. And this is the user ID. It's XELSysADM, and I have my own weird password. So if we go here and look in here, the Java libs, OIM 12C. So here are all the libraries that OIM has that come with the design console. Of course, in this wrapper, we're not using all of these. And then we have the extended libraries. This is pretty much manually created because you need all of these, like I said, to connect to the remote client. You won't deploy any of this with your application. Okay, so all right, we got into the weeds here a little bit, so let's cut this one and come back and get where we should have been to begin with. All right, so like I said earlier, in order to make a connection, we're going to be reading a properties file. Okay, so by default, it's going to read this one here, and this is where all our configuration information is to connect. So we're getting that from the properties file, and then we're setting up an OIM client connection using that environment. Okay, so you set up all these options, and it makes the connection, and you get back an OIM client. And once you get back that client, you can then use it to get other things that are OIM related objects. Okay, so if you want to test the connection using this library here, you create a test class, you extend the helper client, and then you can, this is the boilerplate connection right here. All right, so you're doing a load config. If you pass in null, you're going to, by default, look for this. Then once it loads the configuration, assuming you don't get an exception, you can then log in with that environment. And once again, if you don't get an exception, you're good to go. So once we get our client, and since we're extending this class, we have a get client method that we can use. And with that client, we can get one of the OIM services. Okay, so if we go into the documentation, there's tons and tons of services. You can find them in here, like application instance service. There's the user operations service. There's the attestation operations interface. These are pretty much all different types of services. Most of the old ones that came with OIM originally are down here in the TC area for ThorTech. So that's how you go about getting them with using the API. So now once you get one of these services, that these services can also do things like this one is for reconciliation operations, where you can issue reconciliation events. All right, and so here we're using a client tester connection. Oh, I see. We're trying to get the actual class loader that loaded this class, and we're printing it out. Okay, so this is basically just testing that you can get a connection. All right, and this is how you go about getting a connection. Here's where we're loading the configuration. If the file name is null, we're using the default config, which is jndi.properties. Okay, now once again, this class is only useful for your remote connections and for your testing. You would never use this class in actual OIM code to make a connection. We'll get into that later on when we talk about some of these wrappers. Okay, so so we have the server running. We have all our logging set up. So what we're doing in the logging is we're not logging the wrappers, we're only logging the testers. The wrappers work, so we want to see what's going on in our tests. All right, so let's test the connection. So we can run a test file from NetBeans like that. Look at the output. So, okay, see, we printed out everything in here. All right, and we got success. Nothing blew up. All right, so that's how you go about testing a connection using the wrapper libraries. Okay, so let's go here and look at the properties. All right, so we have this is my wrapper for the OIM properties, and properties are a general thing in that OIM has different ways of getting properties. You have IT resources, which contains connection information to a target system. You have lookup entries, which are basically hash maps for use for configuration type stuff. You can use it to store user roles. You can tie user entitlements to a resource using a lookup. But essentially, they're hash maps. OIM does have some lookups where it allows multiple keys that aren't unique. So those are pretty weird. Then when you run a scheduled task, the scheduled task has properties that you can give it, like this is my JDBC data source name. This is, the name of whatever. You can have all kinds of parameters depending on what your job is doing. OIM also has system properties that define the configuration of OIM itself, and you can use this to get these properties. Okay, now some of these APIs, the newer ones are a little nicer, but you can see the older ones, like here, when you get a lookup table, there's all this loop-de-loop-de stuff. So trying to do this stuff in your OIM code, without some kind of wrapper and copying and pasting this all over the place is just really not the way to go. Okay, so anyway, when you use these properties, OIM has different ways of doing things. So this jar file can get loaded into OIM as a third-party jar, and then let's say you have an OIM scheduled task you want to write, and you need to get lookup properties. Well, this is how you would do it. See, when you don't pass anything in, it's going to use the OIM built-in platform to get everything. So you don't really have to do any of that in your code. So, if you had to do this in every one of your scheduled tasks, you would have to copy and paste that all over. So by loading this wrapper into OIM, you can just use the wrapper, and especially the OIM properties. That's probably, out of all of these wrappers that I wrote, this one is probably the one I use 99.9% of the time in all my scheduled tasks. When you write adapters, you're probably going to use the users, the lookup utilities, or not the lookup, the properties, and the forms, because you're going to need to read the process forms to look at the data that's going to the target system. The rest of these are more or less extended helper classes that you use occasionally, but maybe not as much. And in some cases, the built-in OIM ones are just as good in the newer flavors. So the newer APIs don't need to do the loopy through the result set stuff. All right, so now that we cleared that up, so if you're going to run the properties from the client, of course, you need to get the client first. So here we're doing our boilerplate login, all right, and then we're using our client we're passing the client into the properties. Okay, so when we do that, and we actually pass in the OIM client, we use the client get service to do exactly what we're doing up here in the platform. So these are all the service names. Okay, so anything with a TC in front of it is basically legacy APIs that originally came with Thortex. So is this one. These are the newer ones that OIM did once it switched over to Oracle. After a couple of years, they started using these newer flavor ones, these are the ones that don't have the whole loop-de-loop-de data source stuff, so they're easier to deal with. All right, so now if we want to run this, what we're going to do here is we're going to run it. Let's change this to, let's set the task properties to, let's change this to better. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to run this. We're going to get our OIM properties from our remote client. Then we're going to use the properties to get the lookup for a built-in, this lookup table comes with OIM. Then we're going to print it out using the logger. And then we're going to show the IT resource values for this IT resource. This will contain the database. This is a database connector, so it's going to contain database connection information, which we'll see. You won't get the passwords this way. You have to do something special for that. I'll go into that later. So then we're going to, remember I talked about tasks have properties. So I created this task. It's basically this one. And we're going to get the properties from it. And we're going to print them out first. Then we're going to change the properties and we're going to print them out again. We're going to do all of this from the remote client using the tester. So let's test it. Okay, so here we go. We printed out our lookup table. You can see all the values. Here's our IT resource. There's no custom query. That's the database name, password. The status column is called status. The name of the table is DBAT users. This is the connection information. So you see all that's in the IT resource. And then here we printed out our values. Okay, and now we're going to, then we changed them and we printed them out again, and we should see down here somewhere, we should see better. Okay, so this is how you go about testing these things from the remote client. And there's testers built in here for just about all of these API wrappers. Okay, so what we're going to do now in the next video is we're going to deploy our API wrapper using some of the scheduled tasks that we put in the last videos that we converted from our command line scripts. And then we're going to run it and see the logs and all that good stuff. All right, let's look at some things here important before we move on to the deployment part. So here's your API reference for OIM for this version. Of course, it depends on which version you are, but this is the latest and greatest. Okay, now for other examples besides this, IDM Works has a lot of OIME type stuff. They can have a pretty good explanation on this stuff here. And there's some example code, again, how these jars are needed to make the client connection. See, that's exactly what we're doing. It's pretty much the same. So this is a list of some example API code to do various things. All right, get selected roles from the cart, get selected entitlements, get an IT resource key by application instance name. So if you need an example of how to do said items, you can pretty much find it here using the APIs. This is an old document, but this can give you a little bit of history of how this started. That's mine, and these are both my VM. All right, so now if you notice here in a lot of these testers are pretty much used to create this wrapper. So if you need to make changes to the wrapper, the best thing to do is to make the changes in the tester first, test it individually from here, and when you got it working, then you can put the code back in here and then redeploy. That's really the easiest way to do it. All right, so we have our code here. Let's do a build. All right, let's make sure a couple things with NetBeans here. Packaging, we don't want to copy any dependent jars. All right, so we're good. Now we can go over here. This is our latest one. We're just going to push it up to our VM. Okay, now we can log into our VM and we'll use one of the scheduled tasks. And what am I doing here? Identity, right? Okay, now remember this is a third-party jar. So you can go look at the videos on how to replace the command line with these scheduled tasks. All right, so let's edit it. We want to load. Okay, so we pick here, we want third party. Third party. Let's go get our jar file name. Okay, let me go back to our job. Scheduled task. Okay, this is the jar. This is the jar. Now we can save. And we'll execute. Okay. Then we can go back. Keep an eye on it for a second. some of these, they take a while for them to kick off. It didn't used to be that way, but now they add it to some queue and it's got to wait to get started. Somewhat annoying. I think that might have did it. There we go. Okay, so we loaded our jar. Now we also have that scheduled task that we created to test our helper class, and it's this guy here. Okay, we'll do some videos on this. I already have some up, but I'll create some new ones on how to create the scheduled task and use the wrapper. Okay, so we have it deployed, so let's go over here to our OIM logs. And that last message there was from loading the jar right here. Okay, we'll put a little bit of that in there. Now let's go run the job. Hopefully it runs. See, notice it has our better value. Okay. There we have it. There's the log. So, well, it printed out. I don't have the logging enabled in here yet. We're going to do that in the next video. But you can see the job ran. It printed out lookup and job parms over here. Lookup, job parms. So we can see test value, better value, value 2. So all that is working. We were able to get the lookup back using our wrapper classes. All right, so let's take a look at how we deal with logging next.